The story begins long before the briefcase touched the water, before the body drifted with the tide, before Berlin pored over papers that seemed to whisper the truth Germany most wanted to hear. It begins in a grey, windowless room beneath London, where a handful of men studied the war as if it were a living creature that could be deceived, manipulated and, if they were clever enough, led by the nose into disaster. The year was 1943, a moment when the Allies were ready to claw back Europe one shoreline at a time. But the next step, an invasion of the continent's soft underbelly, was anything but simple. The Germans were convinced the landings would come in Greece or the Balkans, and Adolf Hitler, suspicious of everyone but himself, divided and scattered his divisions like a man shuffling cards he no longer trusted to obey his will. Sicily was the real target, but it bristled with fortifications. Every coastal road and farm track was a potential graveyard for the men who would soon storm it. To crack Sicily open, the Allies needed something the war rarely offered, a perfect lie. Not a rumor, not a half-truth, but a story Germany would devour whole. And in that underground room, the hardest question hovered like smoke. How do you plant a lie inside the enemy's mind so deeply that he believes he discovered it himself? The answer would come from a quiet, sharp-eyed intelligence officer named Ewen Montagu, an unlikely architect of deception. He was not a soldier who commanded charges across open fields, nor a pilot who carved contrails through flak-filled skies. He was something far rarer, a man who understood that the smallest, strangest fragments of human behavior, ink on a page, a photograph in a wallet, the shape of handwriting, could turn armies. Montagu had a calm manner that hid a mind constantly in motion. His notes filled with looping handwriting. His eyes lingered on details others overlooked. The war had pushed him from the world of judges and barristers into one where victories were measured not by territory gained, but by illusions successfully sold. He carried the pressure quietly, though at night, when he stepped out into the London blackout, the weight of it pressed on him like the condensation on the cold stone around him. He and a small team were working within the 20 Committee, an elegant name for a grim business. Their job, build traps of misinformation, and then wrap those traps in the messy, unpredictable texture of real human life. A forged document was easy to make. A believable life was not. The idea that changed the war arrived with the simplicity of an afterthought. What if they fed Hitler a lie through the most reliable courier of all? Death, body washing ashore with classified documents would be tragic, believable, and above suspicion. If the papers pointed to Greece instead of Sicily, German divisions would shift like iron filings dragged by a magnet. The Allies would land on Sicilian beaches thinned of armor, artillery, and the fanatical units Hitler believed essential to guarding Europe's southern gate. But to craft such a deception, they needed a body. And they needed a life to wrap around it, a life convincing enough that even hardened German intelligence officers, paranoid to the edge of madness, would not see the trick. They found the man in silence. The corpse belonged to Glinda Michael, a Welsh drifter who had died in London with no family and no future. In death, he was given a role the war would remember. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a man who never lived, and yet would shape the fate of nations. Montagu felt the weight of this transformation more deeply than anyone else. He once stared at the still figure lying on the table and wondered if wars were cruelest in the moments when men were turned into symbols, ghosts carrying burdens they never chose. But he forced the thought away. If this deception worked, thousands would survive who otherwise would not. The work began. Spies do not simply invent documents, they construct worlds. Montagu and his team had to imagine Major Martin not as a convenient fiction, but as a breathing officer with loves, frustrations, debts, and distractions. They placed theater stubs in his pockets from shows he never saw. They filled his wallet with photographs of a fiancée he never kissed. The woman was a clerk from another department, her smile frozen in a single moment, destined to drift across the Mediterranean on the body of a stranger. There were letters too, affectionate, clumsy, touched with the mundanity of real affection. There was a bill from the tailor, a stern note from a bank, and small wrinkles of paper softened by careful hands, so they looked handled, not planted. The pièce de résistance was the briefcase, battered, used, and heavy with secrets that needed to feel dangerously plausible. Inside were letters describing Allied invasion plans that hinted, subtly, artfully, that Greece and Sardinia were the next targets. Sicily was mentioned only as a diversion. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a message that looked too sensitive to fall into enemy hands, yet not so sensitive that its appearance would raise suspicion. The team rehearsed every detail of Martin's imaginary life. They debated his handwriting, his rank, his habits. They asked questions real officers might answer without thinking. Would he fold letters in half or thirds? Would he carry a receipt from breakfast? Would the ink on his papers smudge in the damp? Building a lie that would kill fewer men was still a strange kind of mercy. Once the fiction was complete, they faced a more unsettling task, ensuring that the body looked like a man who had died from drowning after a plane crash at sea. Time and tide would do some of the work, but they needed the right currents, the right shoreline, the right hands to find him. All of it had to feel like misfortune, not choreography. Huelva, Spain was the answer, neutral on paper, but tilted toward Berlin through the invisible wires of influence. German spies hovered there, waiting for scraps of Allied intelligence, trading cigarettes and quiet promises with Spanish officials who wanted to stay in the good graces of both worlds. If a body washed ashore with a briefcase cuffed to its wrist, German hands would not be far behind. April arrived with a damp cold that clung to London as Montagu watched the final preparations unfold. The submarine HMS Seraph would carry the body to the drop point. The officers aboard had been briefed with only the essentials, though even essentials carried a macabre weight. On the night of departure, the docks were wrapped in a heavy fog that muffled the men's voices. Montagu stood quietly, watching the shape of the submarine emerge through the mist like a living shadow. He had spent weeks crafting an entire man from fragments, and now that creation was leaving him. He handed over the canister containing the body, sealed, solemn, and heavier than its form suggested. The metal was cold beneath his fingers. For a moment he rested his palm against it, not in farewell, but in a kind of quiet promise, that the lie would hold, that death would be the courier who walked unseen through the walls of the enemy. The officers of the Seraph received the instructions in subdued silence. Naval men understood the sea's hunger. They understood that they would be returning one more life to its depths, even if that life had never been lived. Captain Jewell read the orders by the dim red glow inside the submarine's compartment. The words seemed to hover between reverence and discomfort, as if war itself had reached out and demanded a sacrifice no one felt qualified to give. They sailed south. Days passed beneath the ocean's surface, where steel creaked under pressure, and the world narrowed to the low hum of the engines. The body rested in its canister, concealed yet ever present in the minds of the crew. They avoided speaking of it openly, but the knowledge brushed their thoughts like a cold current. When they surfaced off the coast of Spain in the early hours, the sea was mercilessly calm. Moonlight smoothed the water into a pale sheet that seemed to hold its breath. The coastline lay in darkness, neutral Spain, where neutrality meant little and espionage was simply another form of commerce. The officers gathered on the deck. Captain Jewell ordered the canister opened. The air carried the bite of salt and something heavier beneath it. They dressed the body in the uniform Montagu had prepared, fastening the life jacket, adjusting the straps, securing the briefcase to the wrist with a chain. Every movement was deliberate, careful, touched with an odd tenderness. As dawn first bled into the sky, they lowered Major William Martin, Glyndwr Michael, into the sea. The water accepted him without a ripple. He drifted northward, carried by currents the intelligence teams had charted with the precision of surgeons. For a moment, the world held still. Then the submarine slipped beneath the waves, leaving the body alone with the tide, the gulls circling above, and the briefcase that could turn the direction of the war. Somewhere beyond that horizon, German officers waited for the smallest hint of Allied strategy. And somewhere in Berlin, Hitler still believed he could read his enemies like a book. He didn't yet know that the next chapter had already been written by a dead man who never lived. Dawn broke over the southern coast of Spain, with a light so pale it seemed hesitant to reveal what the night had carried ashore. The fishermen of Huelva were already pushing their boats into the tide when one of them noticed a dark shape drifting just beyond the surf line, an outline that the sea rocked gently, as if reluctant to surrender it. They rowed out on instinct, calling to each other in low voices. Even from a distance, the uniform was unmistakable. A British officer, a drowned man delivered by the currents. When they pulled the body into the boat, the briefcase chained to the wrist made their breath catch. Dead men sometimes carried secrets, but this one had the look of someone who had died with them clenched tight. Within an hour, the Guardia Civil was notified, and by midday, word had reached a man who had been waiting for exactly this sort of accident. His name was Adolf Klaus, an Abwehr agent who blended into Huelva as comfortably as a local tradesman. He had spent months cultivating relationships with officials who preferred gold to ideology and information to silence. When whispers reached him about the drowned British officer, the spark of opportunity lit behind his eyes. He did not rush. Rushing raised suspicion. Instead, he made his routine stroll along the waterfront, exchanging pleasantries with fishermen, pausing to examine crates of sardines and salted cod. Only then did he turn toward the small building where Spanish authorities kept such unfortunate discoveries. The room smelled faintly of brine and disinfectant. The officer lay on a table beneath a thin sheet, his face pale, his skin beginning to take on the early waxiness of death at sea. The briefcase sat on a nearby desk, still locked, still chained to the wrist. Klaus's pulse quickened, not visibly, but deep enough that he felt it in the back of his throat. The Spanish doctor assigned to the case looked up with a mixture of pride and apprehension. He knew Klaus, knew what the man represented, and knew the value of making cooperative decisions. Spain was neutral, but neutrality in Huelva was a matter of degrees. Klaus leaned over the body, studying the uniform, the life jacket, the worn leather of the briefcase. Everything fit the story of a crash at sea. There were no obvious red flags, no crude inconsistencies. Still, deceit was a currency of war, and he had been lied to by better men than this corpse. He slipped the chain off the dead man's wrist. The briefcase was cold in his hands. The Spanish officer cleared his throat. "You understand, Herr Klaus. We must be very cautious. Britain will inquire." Klaus offered a courteous nod. "Of course. We merely wish to ensure there is no danger to Spanish security. A simple inspection." The words were gentle, almost brotherly. They were also untrue. Spanish officials handled the briefcase with slow, ceremonial reluctance. They documented it, sealed it, stamped it, then unsealed degrees. Gain. Bureaucracy provided cover for hesitation. Klaus waited through it all, knowing that delay was perhaps the closest thing to suspicion they were capable of showing. Finally, the case was opened. Inside lay the letters, carefully folded, impeccably official, stamped, signed and clearly intended for eyes far above the rank of an ordinary courier. Klaus watched every detail, the creases in the paper, the consistency of the ink, the way the documents had absorbed moisture. They felt real. More importantly, they felt unintended for him. He asked for copies, discreetly, carefully. The Spanish colonel overseeing the investigation hesitated, then nodded. Money would change hands later, after the necessary denials were constructed. By evening, the documents were on their way to Madrid. By midnight, they were in the hands of the German embassy. And within 48 hours, they were being pored over in a secure room by German intelligence officers who understood both the weight of such material and the danger of trusting it. Major Karl Erich Kühlenthal, the Abwehr chief in Madrid, was one of the first to examine the letters. He was meticulous, but he was also a man who desperately needed a breakthrough. The war had turned against Germany in too many places at once. North Africa had slipped away. The U-boat campaign was faltering. The Eastern Front devoured divisions faster than Berlin could replace them. A discovery like this, authentic or not, offered the promise of clarity, and clarity was in short supply. He ran his fingers over the papers, noting the smudged ink, the watermark, the rhythm of military phrasing. Everything matched what he had seen in previous British communications. If it was a forgery, it was done by someone who understood the smallest nuances of Allied administration. He studied the letter that implied a coming invasion of Greece, another that hinted at Sardinia, Sicily mentioned only as a faint decoy. It was all too perfect, and yet perfect things often were. Kulenthal hesitated. A voice deep inside him whispered caution, but another voice, sharper, louder, reminded him that Berlin demanded certainty, not doubt. And certainty was something even the most disciplined officer struggled to produce in a war filled with ghosts, rumors, and the shifting tides of fortune. He sealed the packet and wrote his assessment. The documents were genuine. Within days, they were on their way to Berlin, accompanied by a diplomatic pouch and a message stamped with the weight of urgency. Meanwhile, in Huelva, the Spanish authorities quietly returned the briefcase, now carefully dried, cleaned, and reassembled, to the British consulate. They claimed the contents had never been opened. Their smiles were warm, their assurances smooth. But the British naval attaché, a sharp man with a sharper sense of danger, noticed the faintest disturbance in the papers, a subtle watermark difference, a crease that hadn't existed before. He felt a chill run down his spine. If the papers had been tampered with, and he suspected they had, then somewhere, right now, German hands were turning over information crafted in London's deepest shadows. He sent a coded telegram. London received it without celebration. They did not revel in the theft. They did not rejoice. Instead, they waited in a suspended silence, the air in every room thick with tension. Because deception was never a weapon fired once. It was fired repeatedly in the minds of the enemy, in their councils, in their doubts. And unless German behavior changed, unless troop movements shifted, the entire gambit would crumble under its own audacity. In Berlin, the documents reached the desk of General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief. He read them with narrowed eyes, pacing his office as if the floorboards themselves might reveal the truth. His instinct, honed by years of calculating Allied moves, told him that Sicily was the obvious target. But the papers suggested something different. A strike at Greece, where German positions were precarious, a landing in Sardinia, a grand feint in the central Mediterranean. The evidence was compelling, perhaps too compelling. He brought the papers to Hitler. The Führer studied the documents in near silence. His fingers tapped against the edge of his desk. He had always believed himself a master reader of plans, a man with instinct so profound it bordered on prophecy. For months he had been certain the Allies would not risk Sicily. It was too fortified, too predictable. The briefcase confirmed what he already wanted to believe. He stood, walked to the large map pinned to the wall, and pointed at Greece. "This," he said, "is their true objective." The room stiffened with the gravity of that pronouncement. Orders began forming in the air before they were spoken. Troops shifted. Divisions already stretched thin were rerouted toward the Balkans. Panzer units moved with deliberate haste. Defensive works on Greek shores were reinforced. The trap that Montagu and his team had crafted in the dim rooms beneath London was now being sprung not by British hands, but by German obedience. In Madrid, Kulenthal received jubilant commendations. In Huelva, Spanish officers congratulated themselves on their subtlety. And in Berlin, Hitler believed he had glimpsed the hidden heart of Allied strategy. Only a handful of men in London knew the truth. The war had tilted because a dead man carried a lie across the sea. For the Germans, the deception had become reality, and the reality would soon cost them dearly, not through a single battle, but through a cascade of consequences that would reshape the entire Mediterranean theater. The briefcase had done its job. Now the armies would do theirs. The invasion fleet gathered in silence, scattered across the morning haze like shadows waiting for the sun to choose their shape. On the eve of Operation Husky, the men aboard those ships knew almost nothing of the deception that had cleared a path for them. They knew only the mission: take Sicily, crack open the door to Italy, and push into the heart of Axis Europe. But in the war rooms far from the heaving decks, Allied commanders watched with unusual stillness. They had spent weeks reading intercepted German communications, pieces of confirmation that drifted in like faint echoes from a distant shore. Hitler had swallowed the lie whole. Divisions that would have bled the invasion now stood scattered across Greece and Sardinia. Sicily's defense, though formidable, had been denied the reinforcement it desperately needed. No one celebrated. Celebration was a luxury war rarely allowed. Instead, they waited to see whether the lie would hold long enough for flesh-and-blood men to cross beaches that would soon fire back. On July 9, 1943, the Mediterranean wind shifted. It picked up sand, carried it over the water, and lashed it against the landing craft as they crawled forward. It was a brutal night for a landing. Gusts so strong they tore gliders from their tow lines and flung entire units into the sea. Yet beneath that chaos lay the quiet truth. Fewer defenders waited on those cliffs because a dead man's briefcase had pulled them elsewhere. In a tent lit only by the glow of a single lantern, General Dwight Eisenhower studied the incoming reports. Each message arrived like the beat of a distant drum: initial losses, scattered landings, terrible winds. But with them came the news he needed most. German reserves were still anchored in the east. Panzer units that should have been barreling towards Sicily were instead bracing for a phantom invasion that would never arrive. Operation Mincemeat had not only worked, it had begun to reshape the psychology of the enemy. He folded the telegrams carefully, as if their ink might shift if handled too abruptly. Someone on his staff remarked quietly that deception might have saved more men than any gun in the invasion fleet. Eisenhower said nothing. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who understood the stakes too deeply to indulge in victory before it was earned. On the German side, confusion curdled into something harsher. Reports from Sicily were deeply troubling. Allied forces were pushing through the beaches with alarming speed. Italian garrisons cracked. German officers in the field sent increasingly urgent requests for reinforcements. But in Berlin, the High Command remained captive to the narrative delivered by the briefcase. Hitler insisted the landings in Sicily were only the opening move of a grand feint. Greece, he argued, remained the true objective. The Allies were trying to divide German defenses, trick them into abandoning the Balkans, and leave a path open for a major assault. His generals disagreed, quietly, cautiously. But disagreement rarely survived long in that room. Hitler's certainty devoured dissent. He ordered divisions in the east to stand firm. Sardinia was reinforced. Greece bristled with men who would never fire a shot in the defense of Europe. And in that moment, the deception ceased to be a ruse. It became German doctrine. Meanwhile, in London, Ewen Montagu received the first whispered confirmations. German movements had shifted exactly as they'd hoped, but he felt only a strange numbness. He had spent months constructing the life of a man who never existed, a life woven with such careful intimacy that even now fragments of it clung to his thoughts. The photograph in the wallet, the letter from the invented fiancée, the theater stub placed to look like a moment once lived. Now that the war machine had responded, now that real blood would be spared or spilled based on those fictions, Montagu felt a weight settle across his shoulders that was different from pride. Not regret, not guilt. Something more complicated, a recognition that wars turned on quiet choices few would ever know. He walked through London that evening, the city darkened under blackout, its buildings rising like silhouettes carved from stone. Somewhere nearby, in the corridors of Whitehall, officers pored over maps and telegraph lines. Somewhere even closer, men and women continued their small daily routines, unaware that a drowned stranger on a distant shore had shifted the arc of the conflict. When Sicily finally fell, the outcome echoed beyond the island itself. Italy, shaken by the Allied advance, fractured from the inside. Mussolini was overthrown. The country that had once marched proudly beneath the fascist banner now stumbled into surrender. German forces scrambled to occupy territory their faltering ally could no longer hold. The Mediterranean theater changed overnight, reshaping the momentum of the war months ahead of schedule. And in Berlin, when the realization finally dawned, when the truth behind the papers emerged through rumblings, decoded messages and chilling hindsight, it arrived like a slow, suffocating fog. It is difficult to know when Hitler first recognized the deception. Perhaps it was when Sicily fell faster than his generals predicted. Perhaps it was when the phantom invasions of Greece and Sardinia never came. Or perhaps it was later still, in a rare moment of clarity, one of those thin slivers of insight that cut him only after the damage was done. But by then it no longer mattered. The lie had already hardened into history. Months later, after the invasion of Italy and the liberation of southern cities, Allied analysts reviewed German deployment records. They tracked the divisions that should have been guarding Sicily, the armored units, the mechanized infantry, the Luftwaffe detachments, shifted eastward on spurious orders. The numbers were sobering. Lives had been preserved not through overwhelming force, but through the carefully woven threads of a false life, sent drifting across the sea. Operation Mincemeat would be remembered quietly for years, its details sealed in locked files, whispered in small rooms where intelligence officers traced the outlines of deception like archaeologists brushing dust from a buried artifact. Montagu rarely spoke of it. When he did, he used the language of understatement, as if the operation were merely a curious footnote in the war, rather than one of the most elegant manipulations ever executed by a nation at war. But sometimes, late at night, he would think of the man whose identity they had borrowed. Glyndwr Michael had lived and died in anonymity, a life marked by hardship, loss, and loneliness. Yet in death, he became the fulcrum upon which a continent tilted. Montagu once visited the grave marked with the name Major William Martin, Royal Marines. He stood in the quiet cemetery, the Mediterranean wind moving through the cypress trees, the headstone carved with a title that belonged to a soldier who never breathed. For a moment, he wondered whether the dead, if they could see the paths forged by those who used their names, would understand the strange burdens placed upon them. But the wind offered no reply. Years passed. The war ended. The world reshaped itself. Men returned home or didn't. Maps were redrawn. Cities rebuilt. The consequences of that deception stretched into peacetime in quiet ways, through borders, alliances, and memories. When the truth of Operation Mincemeat finally became public decades later, readers marveled at the audacity, the precision, the sheer improbability of it. They spoke of the brilliance of the planners, the daring of the submarine crew, the almost theatrical tension of the discovery in Spain. Few paused to consider the deeper truth, that victory in war is often built not only on courage and firepower, but on shadows, on whispers, on fragile inventions carried through darkness to shape decisions made by men who believed they were acting with perfect clarity. In the end, the briefcase did more than deceive. It revealed something about the war itself, that truth and falsehood often marched side by side, indistinguishable until the moment one of them collapsed. And somewhere in a quiet cemetery, under a name that belonged to two different men in two different worlds, lay the body that carried a story across the sea, a story that changed the course of armies, toppled a government, and helped open the gates to Europe. War rarely remembers its quiet conspirators, but history sometimes does.